Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Rachel Donovan, a publisher with HQ with Harlequin Books, a division of HarperCollins. Today we're chatting with Kerri Turner for a bit more insight into her new historical fiction novel, The Daughter of Victory Lights. So hi Kerri, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Lovely to see you as always. Just to start us off really quickly, can you give us a bit more insight into the storyline of A Daughter of Victory Lights?
Absolutely. So it follows Evelyn Bell, who, thanks to her wartime work in England's first ever all-female searchlight regiment, she gets a post-war opportunity to join the Victory, which is a boat that sort of combines elements of burlesque, cabaret and variety show performances to create a travelling show that is wild and out there and very much illegal. And on board the boat, Evelyn meets a cast of characters such as Humphrey, who is the owner of the boat and the creator of the show, Bea, a voluptuous burlesque performer who has a few secrets of her own, and Flynn, an American man who served in the Graves Registration Unit during World War II and is really struggling under the weight of the memories of the things he did and saw during those war years. So while on the boat, all the performers, cast and crew have to reckon with the things they did during the war, who it was they thought they were, and who it is they want to be. And then the book jumps to 10 years later and we meet Lucy, a little girl who is being whisked away from the only family and home she has known in London by Humphrey. He's bringing her to the Isle of Wight, where she starts a new life with a cast of characters from the Victory. And she tries to find answers as to what happened to the mother that she never knew.
Thanks, Kerri. So at HQ, we're really big fans of strong, independent women and stories that have that sort of character at their centre. Our Herstory campaign was a set of panels and events. Unfortunately, it was supposed to be run throughout this month. Unfortunately, with the circumstances out there, we couldn't go ahead with that. But just like the spirit of our rebellious women, we will find a way, any kind of way, to have a chat about all the rebellious women that are at the heart of our stories. And I think Evie Bell is probably the poster child for such a rebellious woman. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about what the first spark was for this story, you know, why this kind of era of history, and a little bit more about Evie and her rebellious spirit at heart?
Absolutely. So the very first spark of an idea for this novel was actually the Victory boat, which came to me in a dream, which is a very odd way to start a book. But I kind of worked my way backwards from there into finding the story that went with the boat and the cast of characters I dreamt up on it. What I did know was that their experiences on this boat were very much informed by what they had gone through during World War II. So that was what I was researching. I was researching World War II, particularly focusing on women's roles in World War II because of my character Evelyn, and I wanted to know how she had ended up on board the Victory. And through that research, I discovered the all-female searchlight regiments. And this was new to me. I thought it was a role that was very dangerous and highly skilled, very interesting, and really instrumental in saving many, many lives of civilians, and also bringing the war about to its end. It wasn't the only role like that I found, though. I came across so many different women's roles throughout World War II that likewise were very dangerous, very highly skilled, but just aren't widely known. And it got me asking the question, why? Why is this not widely known? You know, we know a lot about the war. We know a lot about the different efforts that went on to bring the war to an end, but not these women's roles. And what I ended up discovering through my research was that they had been systematically silenced because it was considered very offensive and an insult to returning servicemen for these women to speak about their wartime roles, even though many of them had sacrificed so greatly and sacrificed their friends' lives, their loved ones' lives to these roles that they were performing. And a lot of the women went along with it, because we're talking an era where, we were still a couple of decades away from the women's movement. Women did not have a lot of power and influence. So they went along with it out of fear of being ostracized or being declared unpatriotic. No one wants to be declared that post-World War II. But there were some women who rebelled against that. And Evie is very much one of them. She did not want to go back to that sort of pre-war box when the war had changed the entire world.
Thanks. So moving on to a little bit more about the performing side of this area of history. After training in ballet, you studied the history of dance, and one thing becomes very clear throughout the book is that this post-war period was a fascinating time for the art of burlesque. Can you tell us a bit more about these performances and why you think they drew artists and audiences to the stage, given their illegal nature?
Sorry, adjusted it now. Yes, so as I said, the Victory had an element of cabaret and variety shows, but burlesque was the main element that I drew on very heavily for their performances. And that was because it had this sort of booming era post-World War II, despite it being illegal. Not only illegal to perform it, but even illegal to watch it. And as I did my research into why then it was so popular if it was illegal, it all really started to make sense to me. And it was because I found out that burlesque was the ultimate form of female rebellion. So people had gone through all the deprivation, the sacrifice of the war years, the constant threat of dying at any minute, fighting for freedom, only for women to be told afterwards that the freedom they were granted looked like one thing and one thing only, and that did not include the right to say what they did with their own bodies. And the women of burlesque pretty much went, you know what? No. You can make as many laws as you want. You can send as many policemen after me that you want, but I get to decide what I do with my own body. Burlesque was the most sort of sparkling, exuberant, joyful way they could show this defiance and take that freedom for themselves that they had fought for.
There's quite a bit of reworking process that goes on behind the scenes, bringing a book to publication. And in the very first version of the manuscript, there was this fabulous scene with Humphrey learning the ropes at the Windmill Theatre and the challenges of a burlesque show. You touched on it a little bit in your previous answer, but can you run us through that scene just as a special treat and a bit more about what they faced?
Absolutely. So Humphrey works at the Windmill Theatre as his first ever job outside of school. And the Windmill Theatre was a real theatre in London, and it was famous for three things. One was that it never closed throughout all of World War II, so it was a great source of sort of national pride and patriotism, because this place of joy and laughter and scandalousness stayed open no matter how many bombs were dropped on them. The second reason it was famous was because of the windmill steeplechase, and I will come back to that in a second. The third reason it was famous was for its tableau vivants. So it had this show called Revue de Ville, and Revue de Ville was very much a sort of variety program. Excuse me. Revue de Ville was very much a variety program, but the highlight of the show were these tableau vivants, otherwise known as living photographs. So censorship laws at the time dictated that women were not allowed to be seen nude publicly. However, the manager of the Windmill Theatre, a Mr. Vivian Van Dam, discovered a loophole in these laws, which meant they could be seen nude if they were not moving. So he created these living photographs in which these women would get all dressed up, usually in a theme like ancient Egypt or the French court or something like that. And the curtain would raise and you would see all these beautiful women posing nude and very, very still. There was also another sort of loophole that he kind of exploited a little bit, but in a very clever way, where he thought that if you had a woman, say, spinning on a rope, It was not the woman that was moving, it was the rope that she was clinging to. And he actually got away with this, and it kept the shows very fresh and very interesting. And because these tableau vivants were so popular, they resulted in the Windmill steeplechase that I mentioned earlier. And Humphrey, while working there, he witnesses the Windmill steeplechase. What would happen was that at the end of a performance, all the men in the back rows would jump up and run for the front seats. And when I say run, they were climbing over the backs of the chairs. There were many a black eye and a bloody nose copped by the people who were still seated in these chairs, because it was this huge race to try to get the front row seats for the next show. And Humphrey, witnessing this, he's just gobsmacked at the lengths that people will go to see this kind of show. And the other performers that he works with there say, like, oh, you think that's impressive? You should see the burlesque clubs. Because the burlesque clubs did not play in these loopholes. They did have their women moving and dancing, so they were very much illegal. Humphrey decides to go to one of these burlesque clubs and see what it's all about. And while he's there, a little blue light bulb on the back wall lights up, and everyone starts to run. And this was a real thing that happened. All burlesque clubs throughout London had a blue light bulb on their back wall, and the doorman or doorwoman, if they saw the police show up for a raid, they had a hidden switch that they would flick, which would turn the light bulb on, giving the performers and the audience a minute or two head start run from the law. So Humphrey runs from the police. He manages to evade capture, which is very lucky, because he finds out that if he was captured, he would spend the night in jail for having been there. And he's kind of struck again by the lengths that both performers and audiences would go to for these sorts of performances. They would risk, getting a black eye at the Windmill Theatre. They would risk a night in jail at burlesque clubs. And it made him start to think about ways of putting on his own show that could kind of circumvent the police raids that made life very difficult for performers and audience alike. And he comes up with the idea for the Victory. Because it's a travelling boat, it doesn't spend a great deal of time. It moves from port to port. And it also means that the audiences have to get in their own boats and row out in the waters of a river or an ocean to see their performance. He figures that the police are not going to be bothered with going to that level of effort to raid them when there are plenty of clubs still on land to be raided, but that audiences, from what he's seen, will go to that kind of effort to see a show. And luckily, he was right.
Absolutely, wily old Humphrey. Writing historical fiction obviously takes a ton of research, which you're given us a bit of detail about. Is there any other what other kind of research did you do for the book? Maybe even interesting, like some interesting unknown to you little nuggets that surprised you? Were there anything like that?
As I said, the 93rd Searchlight Regiment was a big surprise to me because of how dangerous their work was and how instrumental it was. They were involved in lighting up enemy Luftwaffe planes that were coming in to bomb London so that the anti-aircraft gunners could try to bring them down. And what was interesting about that I learned was it was in some ways more dangerous than the male anti-aircraft gunner jobs were, because London was operating under blackout laws. So the pilots in the enemy planes could see nothing except for this great big spotlight suddenly pointing at them. And they would fire back at the spotlight because it's the only thing they could see to fire back at. The anti-aircraft gunners were set quite some distance away from the spotlight women because they needed to protect both their lives and all the ammunition there. So I thought it was very interesting that we've all heard of anti-aircraft gunners and what they did in defending their countries during the Blitz and World War II, but we didn't hear about the women who were putting their lives on the line every single day as well. And I also came across the Graves Registration Unit, which I think I mentioned earlier, which was a very interesting role in which, in American services, where men would come in after a battle had gone through a field, they would come into the battlefield and they were tasked with identifying and gathering and burying the remains of the fallen men. It was a horrific job, and it was a job that resulted in very high rates of PTSD, which of course, given the era, went unacknowledged and untreated and created a lot of difficulties for the men who'd been in those roles. And that plays a very big role in the book as well, and in how Evie and Flynn both sort of relate to each other. They've both been through traumas in the war years, but they both sort of deal with them differently afterwards. So that was a really big help finding out those little nuggets of information. And I really hope that people learn something new about these roles from that, because it was definitely new to me and I feel like more people should know about them.
Thanks. So it's not just London that has such a starring role as a practically a character in the book. The Isle of Wight is also has a really strong atmosphere in the storyline. Can you give us a bit of an armchair insight into what it's like and how it influenced that portion of the story?
Absolutely. So I wanted somewhere that, for the Lucy section of the book, felt close enough to London where Lucy had grown up, that the people that she would eventually live with on the Isle of Wight could feel as though they kind of kept an eye over her throughout all these years. But when she moves away to be with them, I also wanted a sense of sort of otherworldliness, somewhere completely different to London. And the Isle of Wight was perfect for that. It is quite close to London. It takes an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending where you start in London and depending on traffic. But I did the drive from London to Portsmouth. And then you have a car ferry, which you drive your car onto, because the only way to access the Isle of Wight is via ferry. And they did have these car ferries in the 60s. I actually saw footage of the 1960s ferries on YouTube, and it's slightly different to how it is now, for which I'm very thankful. In the 60s, the wheels of the car would literally be in the water as they were going onto the ferry. So we didn't have that experience, but we did catch the ferry. Me and my husband caught the ferry over to the Isle of Wight and stayed there for several days, exploring every single place that is mentioned in part 2 of the book. So Bonchurch Village, where Lucy lives, Ventnor Beach, that she visits with Bea, the Osborne House, which is Queen Victoria's residence that Humphrey takes her to. I have been to all those places and did my research there. And it was exactly the right place for this, childlike wonder and this feeling of being somewhere completely different, because the Isle of Wight is not big, but it's a changing landscape again and again and again. There's open fields, there's seaside villages, there's cobblestone beaches, there's trees that sort of make a tunnel over the road. And I just thought it was just so perfect to have this little 10-year-old girl who's frightened of coming to this new place where she knows no one, but then having a sense of awe and a sense of adventure that this new life might be a little bit exciting after all.
Fabulous. Okay. One last sort of insight into the whys and the wherefores behind the book. Obviously, this is your second novel in historical fiction. Your debut in 2019 was The Last of the Romanoff Dancers. What type of historical moments sort of capture your attention? What do you hope readers will take from this book or your work in general?
I'm always drawn to those sort of unknown moments. I mean, they're not completely unknown. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to find out about them in the first place. But those moments that are just not widely known, because I love learning about those things. I love seeing these people that really I feel like I owe so much to, because our lives today wouldn't be the way they are if these people hadn't contributed and sacrificed in the way they did. And that's what I hope people take from them as well. I love it when people open my books and go, oh, I had no idea that these roles or these people existed, and I feel like I should have. And I'm like, yes, I feel that way too, and that's why I wrote the book. So it's always those sort of little moments that are gradually being uncovered as more and more people become more comfortable with talking about the things they did throughout these years. And I'm just trying to shine a little bit of a light on them.
Okay, that's all we have time for. But thanks, Kerri, for coming in and having a chat to us about The Daughter of Victory Lights. It's so exciting to see it looking so wonderful out there. Just a reminder that it's available through all online bookshops and in ebook. Yeah, I recommend having a read of this stellar and stunning, fantastic, and very insightful look into women in post-war World War II.